On a morning in April of 1946, a man named Tate Drummond drove his father's pickup truck down the main street of Harlan, Iowa, and stopped in front of the feed store where three men were sitting on the bench outside, the way men sit on benches outside feed stores in small Iowa towns, with the particular relaxed authority of people who have been observing the same street long enough to feel entitled to an opinion about everything that moves along it. Tate got out of the truck. He was 28 years old, and he had been home from the Pacific for 4 months, and he was still learning every day the specific geography of a life lived with one arm. His right arm was gone from just below the shoulder, taken by a Japanese artillery shell on a beach in the Philippines in October of 1944. He had tried the prosthetic the military hospital in San Francisco had fitted him with, used it for 2 weeks, and set it aside because it was less useful than learning to do everything with his left hand. The three men on the bench watched him go inside. After the door closed, one of them, a man named Gerald Combs, who farmed 400 acres north of town, said something that made the other two laugh. What Gerald said was that he supposed the Drummond boy was going to try to farm his father's ground, and he'd like to see how that worked out with one arm. Tate heard it through the door. Feed store doors in 1946 were not soundproof, and Gerald Combs was not a quiet man. Tate stood inside for a moment with his left hand on the counter. Then he ordered what he'd come for, loaded it into the truck himself, and drove home without saying anything to anyone. He did not tell his father what Gerald Combs had said. His father, Earl Drummond, was 61 years old and had farmed 200 acres in Shelby County his entire adult life, and Tate did not want to give his father something to carry that Tate intended to carry himself. He went to the equipment shed when he got home and stood in front of the 1947 Oliver 88 that Earl had bought the previous fall. A 6-cylinder gasoline engine, enough horsepower to pull a 3-bottom plow through Shelby County soil with authority. Earl had bought it because Tate was coming home, and Earl had believed, before he understood fully what coming home meant in Tate's case, that the two of them would farm together the way he had always imagined. Tate stood in front of the Oliver and looked at the controls: the steering wheel, the throttle, the gear shift, the clutch and brake pedals, the hydraulic lever. He had been looking at these controls in his mind for weeks, mapping the sequence of actions against the single hand he had available, and asking the question he asked about everything now: how do I do this with what I have? Let me tell you about Tate Drummond, because the man deserves to be understood before the story of what he built can mean anything. Tate had grown up on Earl's farm and had been driving tractors since he was 12. He had the innate mechanical understanding that grows in boys raised around equipment that must be maintained and repaired and operated with care, the ability to feel a machine's behavior through the controls and understand from that feeling what the machine needs. He had been, before the war, the kind of farmer that other farmers watched when they wanted to see how a job should be done. He had also been right-handed. The artillery shell had not only taken his arm, it had taken the version of himself he had been planning to return to. What it left him was a body that worked differently, a mind that was intact and experienced and capable, and the question of how to reconnect the two in a way that let him do the work he understood and wanted to do. He spent 3 weeks in April and May of 1946 doing something that would have struck most observers as either impressive or heartbreaking. He drove the Oliver around Earl's fields, not doing field work, but experimenting, trying different approaches to the coordination problems that conventional tractor operation presented to a one-armed operator, holding the steering wheel with his knee while shifting, bracing his elbow against the fender while managing the throttle, learning where the tractor's own momentum could substitute for the active input that a second hand would have provided. He filled a notebook with observations. Not emotional observations, mechanical ones. This works but creates a half-second gap in steering at the moment of the shift. This approach works on flat ground but not on a side slope. This is reliable but requires the seat adjusted 3 inches forward. The notebook of an engineer solving a problem, which was exactly what Tate was doing. Gerald Combs drove past the field one afternoon and saw Tate on the Oliver, moving slowly in what looked like an irregular pattern, stopping, backing up, trying again. Gerald drove to the cafe in Harlan and told the men at the counter that Earl Drummond's boy was out there running the Oliver like he was lost. The men nodded in the way men nod when they don't want to disagree but aren't comfortable agreeing either. What Gerald had seen was not a man who was lost. It was a man mapping a problem with the attention of someone who intended to solve it, and understood that solving it required understanding it completely first. Before we go further, I want to say something directly. If you have ever watched someone work around a limitation that other people had decided was disqualifying and felt the quiet anger of knowing they were wrong, this story is for you. What Tate Drummond did in the spring of 1946 was not inspirational in the soft sense of that word. It was technical and methodical, and it required a sustained, unsentimental problem solving that most people don't fully understand. Subscribe if you haven't already. This story deserves your full attention. The solution Tate arrived at was not a single modification. It was a system, each piece addressing a specific limitation that his experimentation had identified. The first modification was to the gear shift. Standard shifting on the Oliver 88 required one hand on the wheel and one on the lever simultaneously. Tate fabricated in Earl's shop over 3 evenings. A gear shift extension that relocated the lever to a position reachable with his left hand without releasing the steering wheel, using a pivoting mount that allowed the lever to swing to within 6 inches of the wheel's left side. He taught himself to weld left-handed over the previous 2 months. It took 3 attempts before the geometry was right. The second modification relocated the hydraulic lever from the right side of the operator station to the left. A straightforward repositioning that required rerouting the control cable and fabricating a new bracket, neither beyond the capabilities of Earl's shop. The third modification was technique rather than hardware. At the end of each field row, an operator needed to simultaneously steer the turn, disengage the implement with the hydraulics, and manage the throttle and clutch. For a 2-armed operator, these actions distributed naturally. For Tate, they needed to be sequenced against the tractor's momentum in ways that used the machine's own behavior to substitute for inputs he could not provide simultaneously. He practiced until the sequence was as automatic as the 2-handed version had been before the war. By the end of June 1946, Tate Drummond was farming. Not experimentally, productively. He planted Earl's corn in the back 40 with the Oliver and the 2-row planter, working at a pace slower than a 2-armed operator, but consistent and accurate. Earl walked the field after Tate had finished and said the stand was as even as any he had put in himself. Earl was not a man who said much about things that moved him, but he walked that field for a long time. The harvest that fall was solid. Corn that covered operating costs and left a margin Earl had not expected after a year of uncertainty about whether the farm would function at all. Gerald Combs heard about it at the elevator and asked enough questions to understand that Tate had planted and harvested it alone. He drove away without saying what he had said on the bench outside the feed store in April. Now let me tell you about the years that followed, because the 1946 harvest was not the end. It was the beginning of something that grew in a direction nobody in Harlan had anticipated. In the winter of 1946, Tate spent his evenings in the shop thinking about other farmers in his situation. Not only one-armed farmers, though there were more of them than most people realized in the year after the war, in a country that had sent millions of young men into situations that returned some of them with parts missing. He was thinking about the broader question of equipment modification for operators whose physical capabilities differed from the 2-arm standard that agricultural equipment was designed for. He had solved his own problem. The approach was transferable. The methodology of systematic problem identification, specific modification design, fabrication, testing, and technique development was something Tate could teach. And the fabrication skills that made the modifications possible were skills that a properly equipped shop could provide to operators who didn't have one. In the spring of 1947, a farmer from the next county named Willis Harp drove to Earl's farm and asked to speak with Tate. Willis had lost his right hand to a combine accident in 1943 and had been managing with hired help in a reduced operation that was costing more than he could sustain. He had heard, through the network that travels in farming communities, that Earl Drummond's boy had figured out how to run a tractor alone. Tate spent 2 days with Willis. He walked him through the Oliver modifications, explained the reasoning behind each one, assessed Willis's specific situation, a different tractor, a different dominant hand, different tasks, and developed modification recommendations specific to Willis's equipment and operation. Willis came back a month later with his tractor on a trailer, and Tate spent 3 days in Earl's shop, fabricating and installing the modifications. He charged Willis for the materials and nothing for the labor. Willis's wife came to pick Willis up when the work was done. She looked at the modifications and asked Tate what he charged. Tate said he wasn't charging. She said she thought he should be. She said there were men in 3 counties who needed exactly what he'd done for Willis and who would pay fairly for it. Tate thought about that for 2 weeks. Then he talked to Earl. Earl listened and asked 2 questions: whether Tate had the skills to do the work reliably, and whether there was enough demand to make it worth the time. Tate said he believed so on both counts, but wouldn't know until he tried. Earl said, "Then try." The shop opened in the fall of 1,947 inches of building. Tate constructed himself over the summer on the north side of Earl's equipment shed. A welding station, a fabrication bench, a used drill press from a closing machine shop in Council Bluffs, and a hand tool collection Tate had been assembling for 2 years. Word traveled the way word travels in farming communities. By the spring of 1948, Tate had more work than he could do alone. He hired a young man named Carl Briggs, who had grown up on a farm and had mechanical aptitude, and who learned from Tate with the efficiency of someone learning from a teacher who has worked out the method through hard experience. By 1950, the shop had 3 employees and was doing modification work across 6 counties. The scope had expanded beyond single-arm operators to any modification that allowed a farmer with a physical limitation to operate equipment that conventional design assumed 2 fully functional arms and legs, including modifications for farmers who had lost legs, farmers with severe arthritis, farmers with partial vision loss, farmers who were outside the standard physical dimensions that equipment manufacturers designed for. Each modification followed the same approach Tate had used in the spring of 1946. Systematic identification of specific limitations, design of modifications, addressing those limitations with minimum necessary change, precise fabrication, testing and adjustment, documentation for subsequent service work. Gerald Combs drove past Tate's shop in 1952 and saw 3 tractors parked outside waiting for work. Saw Carl and a second employee visible inside. Saw the building that had grown since 1947. He did not stop. He had stopped saying things about Tate Drummond in 1948 when it became clear that what he had said outside the feed store was the kind of thing a man regrets. By 1955, Drummond Equipment Modifications was the largest employer in Harlan outside of the county's agricultural operations. 12 employees. A facility expanded twice. A customer base reaching into Nebraska and Missouri. Equipment manufacturers had begun consulting with Tate about accessibility modifications that could be incorporated into new designs rather than retrofitted afterward. He had also been buying land, not as his primary interest, but because the business generated capital and Shelby County farmland was what Tate understood and trusted. He bought carefully, evaluating each parcel with systematic attention. By 1958, he owned 640 acres, in addition to Earl's original 200, which had come to him when Earl died in 1954. He farmed all of it, with the Oliver 88 and with subsequent equipment he modified as he acquired it. Working with the precision that 2 decades of one-armed farming had built into his technique. In 1965, a reporter from the Des Moines Register drove to Harlan to write about the business and asked to see the tractor that had started it all. Tate walked him to the equipment shed and showed him the Oliver, pointed out the gear shift modification and the hydraulic relocation, explained what each one did and why it was necessary. The reporter asked how long it had taken to figure out. Tate said 3 months of experimentation and about 2 seconds of understanding that the alternative was not farming and that the alternative was not acceptable. The story ran in the Register and was picked up by agricultural publications across the Midwest. It generated letters that took Tate 6 months to answer. Farmers, veterans, family members of people with physical limitations. He answered every one. He answered technical questions technically and personal questions with the directness of a man who had no patience for sentiment, but a great deal of patience for honesty. One letter came from a 24-year-old veteran who had lost his right arm in Korea and was trying to decide whether to return to his family's farm or find something else to do. Tate wrote 2 pages in his left-handed script. He told the young man that the physical limitation was a problem with a solution if he was willing to find it, and that finding it required the same systematic attention that any mechanical problem required. He told him that Gerald Combs had laughed at him outside the feed store in April of 1946 and had stopped laughing by 1948. He told him the silence that replaced the laughter was not satisfaction, because Tate had not been farming to prove Gerald wrong. He had been farming because it was what he wanted to do and because no one had the right to tell him otherwise. He told the young man to go back to the farm if that was what he wanted. Then he told him to call if he needed help with the modifications. The young man called. His name was Robert Marsh, and he farmed 180 acres in Lynn County for the next 40 years and sent Tate a Christmas card every year until Tate died. Tate Drummond died in 1987 at the age of 69. The business employed 23 people. His son James continued both the farm and the business until 2004, when James's own son took over. The 1,947 Oliver 88 is in the equipment shed on what is now the 3rd generation's farm, not used for field work since 1971, but maintained on schedule, oil changes, and valve adjustments, and the methodical attention of a family that learned from Tate that equipment kept in good condition is equipment that is ready when you need it. The gear shift modification is still on it. The hydraulic lever relocation is still on it. Everything Tate fabricated in Earl's shop in the spring of 1946 is still there, functional. A record in steel and welding of the problem he solved and the method he used to solve it. James's son shows it to people sometimes. He explains the modifications technically, with reference to the specific problem each one addressed. He tells the story of Gerald Combs on the bench outside the feed store, not with anger but as context, as the thing that happened before, the thing that mattered. The thing that mattered was what Tate did after he heard it. He went home and stood in front of the Oliver and started asking how. Let me say something before we close, and I want to say it simply because the story has already said most of it. Tate Drummond did not overcome his limitation. He worked with it, which is a different thing. Overcoming suggests the limitation was defeated, that it stopped being present. It was always present. Every morning when he climbed into the Oliver seat and every evening when he climbed out. What changed was not the limitation, but his understanding of it. His ability to map it precisely against the work he needed to do and find the specific modifications that allowed the work to continue. That is something more useful than inspiration. It is a story about the kind of attention that solves problems other people have decided are unsolvable. The kind that looks at a constraint and asks how, instead of accepting that the constraint defines what is possible. Gerald Combs asked whether a one-armed man could farm and decided the answer was no. Tate Drummond asked how a one-armed man could farm and spent 3 months in a field finding out. One of those questions had an answer. The other one only had a laugh. If this story meant something to you today, drop one word in the comments that describes Tate Drummond. Just one. Share this with someone who has been told their situation defines what they can do, who needs to hear that the right question is not whether, but how. Subscribe if you haven't already. These are the stories worth keeping, and I want you here for every one of them.